If you like the video, make sure to like, subscribe, and comment. For more videos like this, what is your creepy story of living alone or being alone in the house? I was home alone when I was about 13. Mom was at work and my sister was at school while I skipped as I always tended to. It was about 1 p.m. when I picked up the phone to call my mom, and this was back when landline phones were more common. So it was one of those pick it up then dial ones, but as you know, if you picked up a landline phone mid-conversation you'd join the phone conversation, or you could at least listen in, if you had multiple phones in the house. We only had one phone in the house, and it was this one. The only TV on in the house that was on was in me and my sister's room, and it wasn't loud enough at all to be heard downstairs where the phone was. So this definitely f***ed with me. I picked up the phone, and instead of a dial tone, I heard static, but not, like, loud static? Just the white noise you'd hear over the phone when it's quiet on the other line, you know? Then I heard a voice of a young English girl, which is also weird because I live in Scotland and didn't know anyone from England, and she said, "Can you put that down please?" To which I got a little spooked and answered, "What? Hello?" And she didn't seem to hear me, or if she did, she didn't want to answer. She just kept saying, "Please stop that, don't do that, put that down, please stop, please put that down, don't touch that," in a sort of calm voice, almost melancholic at first, but getting more and more upset. I asked again, "Hello? Who are you?" And then heard the sound of fabric rustling near the phone like someone was shifting, and a grunt like a person would when getting up, and then I got freaked out by all this and just hung up the phone, ran upstairs, and didn't tell anyone until later that night when I told my mom, who lifted the phone herself and got a dial tone. She did not believe me, she was just skeptical but obviously disturbed by how upset I was over it. I think about it every so often and feel a little sick. I didn't know what to do at the time, I just freaked out and bailed, but I can't help but feel I gotta listen in on something sort of horrible. The little girl sounded upset, and it sounded like there was someone with her. I don't know what I could have done, but I sure as shit didn't do it. This was 11 years ago now, and I've since moved out of that house and live in my own apartment. My story happened a few years ago, back when I was still living with my mother. She had recently lost her job and she was going through some heavy depression, so she would occasionally go visit with my grandparents, who lived just next door. One day, I had gotten into the shower and she cracked the door to let me know that she was going over for a bit, and she'd be back a little later. I figured it'd give me a little alone time, some time to play some games and just recharge, since her depression had been starting to affect me, too. I get out of the shower and head into my room, which means I would have to pass her doorway. Looking in, everything seemed to be in order, nothing looked strange or out of place. It was a weird habit I've had that I'll look in her room as I pass by. So, as I'm in my room and drying off and dressing, I hear the sound of her sliding closet door move. This door is really heavy and impossible for the wind to move, so I figured my mom might have forgotten something and came back to grab it, and I just didn't hear her. So, I go to look into her room and nothing has moved. These doors make a pretty distinct sound, and I'd heard it so many times, I knew what it was immediately. My mom wasn't in her room, and she wasn't anywhere in the apartment. I was kind of freaked out, especially since I had a habit of seeing shadows on the wall moving down the hall towards our bedrooms. This apartment has always kind of spooked me a bit. But I love it all the same. These are my mom's stories, not mine. When I was 5 to 10 years old, we lived in a townhouse not too far from where I live now. Every other weekend my brother and I would go to my dad's, leaving my mom home alone. She'd be sitting on the couch and hear furniture being dragged across the floor upstairs. Obviously we were gone and no one else was home. This happened often, multiple times a week, and even when we were home. One time my dad had came by after we were in bed and heard it too. He asked what we, my brother and I, we doing awake dragging things around. My mom said it wasn't us. He called bullshit and went upstairs to catch us. We were asleep. Other times the taps would turn on, mostly the one in the bathroom connected to my mom's room. It happened too often I guess, and eventually she had enough and yelled up, "You can turn it off cause you're not scaring me." It turned off. Another time, she had went to bed. We were gone. She told me not 10 minutes after she got in bed she heard the sound of heavy steps coming up the stairs. Her bedroom was at the top of the stairs, so when you walked up the last stair, her door was right there. So she's listening, thump thump, silence. It stopped right at her door. She said it was the only time she had been scared in that house. There are so many stories from this place, I could go on and on. How she sat alone at night despite the things that went on are beyond me. So the backstory is that I work at 24/7 roster and I, obviously, am single and live alone. I finished my night shift at 7 a.m. and went home. I was meeting my mum for brunch, so I laid down in bed but set an alarm every 5 minutes so I didn't crash and miss her knock on the door. I laid on my side, facing the closed concertina sliding door that separates my bedroom and living room. This is Australia in summer, so 8 a.m. means full daylight streaming in, door has to be shut or it's blinding. I hear the clink of keys, then the grinding of one entering the keyhole of the front door. First thought is, but mum doesn't have a set of keys, then I realize I can't sit up, or move at all. I hear footsteps on the kitchen lino, the key coming out, the door shutting, then footsteps on the carpet and the thud of a handbag being dropped. Then a voice says, "I'm home, hun." Don't know to explain the accent. I call it restrained Aussie. You imagine an Aussie accent as "yeah, how's it garn my," but restrained as Aussie reduces emphasis on vowels. Says Candace Carnt. Alexander. Vases Vars. Anyway, it's clearly a woman's voice, and I hear her plop onto the chaise of the couch and slowly remove her boots. Then a few more steps on the carpet and the concertina door slides open. There stands the spitting image of what I perceive to be attractive. A gal, 5'5", 5 feet 6 inches. Homely looking, long straight hair, chubby but not overweight. Her face and tones are kind of a blur, except her smile radiates and the daylight shines around her. She says, "I'm just gonna crash," kisses me on the forehead, then walks around the bed, behind me. I feel the weight of the bed shift as she lazily plops onto the mattress and adjusts herself. As soon as she stops, I feel my paralysis lift and I roll over. Obviously, no one there. But a few things are really unsettling about this. At no point did my eyes open. Meaning this was a hallucination, not a dream. Knowing that, it means my brain was actively blocking information. For one, the concertina door was always open, so my mind was both blocking the light that was hitting my eyes from the other room and created a memory of me shutting the door. The other is that it was pre-compensating my body weight on the mattress to adjust to normal when the dream gal sat on the bed behind me. Around about 20 years old, I was living alone in a quiet apartment complex with my 2 adult cats and corn snake. I'm a bad sleeper, so when I fell asleep one night around 2 a.m., that was actually pretty good for me. Right at 4 a.m. I'm woken up by a single, sudden crash. I assume it's my cats chasing each other around, probably got up on top of the terrarium again and knocked the snake's lamp down, so I start to get up to scold them and fix the heat lamp. But I can't, because they're both on top of the comforter, effectively pinning me down with it, huddled together in one ball, all puffed and vibrating with fear, huge saucer eyes, ears pinned back. I've had cats my whole life and I still have one of those too, never seen that reaction before or since, to anything. Curiosity killed the cat speaks to their usual stupid reaction to danger, being better go investigate it. Now I'm fully awake but more angry than scared, so I decide I better go investigate it. The way the space is laid out, when you exit the bedroom you cross over the foyer, front door to your left, and immediately enter the kitchen. The front door isn't open, nothing in the foyer, so I flip on the kitchen light, and even now, more than 10 years later, I can't explain what events led to what I saw. My plastic dish drying rack was at the foot of the stove, upside down, and what had been in it when I went to bed, a cereal bowl, a small Tupperware, some flatware, a plastic cup, was scattered around it, the bowl broken. This item belonged next to the sink, pushed back against the backsplash, and it had been there when I went to bed at 12. The sink was directly opposite the stove with about 8 feet of open floor space between them. Even if it made more than no sense that the dish drainer just crept up to the edge of and then fell off the counter all on its own, that still wouldn't account for the other 8 feet it traveled, and evidently with some force. I picked it all up and went back to bed. I couldn't think of anything else to do. The next day I thought I dreamed it until I went out into the kitchen and saw it all sitting there where I'd left it. It's troubling enough to think that something was throwing my shit around in the night, but my cat's reaction to it is what really still bothers me to this day. They look like they both came within a hair's breadth of cardiac arrest right on the spot. My fiancé and I purchased a foreclosed home in a not-so-great neighborhood a few years back. We ignored the area because of the great price, but now realize we were idiots because of things like this. I'm lying in bed, barely awake while watching TV. Fiancé is still at work, so I can't sleep. It's 2 a.m. and I'm barely dozing to the crime show that was on when I hear scratching at the window. The window that was 1 foot away from me while lying in bed. I remember thinking damn squirrels when I heard the squirrels start cursing and mumbling. Then the sound of a screwdriver lifting the window frame starts up. I start screaming bloody murder, that I have a gun and I'm calling the cops. The scratching noises stopped, and by the time the cops got to my door and searched the yard, there was no one there. Thinking, oh great, they think I'm crazy, I thank them, and as they're walking back to their cruisers, their radios all started going off at once that there was another break-in reported in my neighborhood. The officers go scrambling off and I slam the door and lock it, once again, freaking out. I go get back in the bed to wait for fiancé to get home. He calls on his way and wants me to stay on the phone with him until he gets here. I hear loud footsteps on the wooden shed ramp in our backyard and say, "Oh good, you're home," and hang up, walking to the back door. He called me straight back and told me he still wasn't even in the neighborhood, so once again, I'm calling 911 and losing my shit. He and the cops got there at the same time and searched the yard again. Apparently, they'd been getting calls all night about some meth head trying to break into the same few houses all night with a screwdriver. They'd been one step behind him the whole night and had cruisers everywhere. Oh, and the cursing at the window? One of the officers went to the bedroom window and saw the screen removed. Methwiz had disturbed a huge wasp nest when he took the screen off, and my tiny little wasp defender saved the day. Last year I was renting a house in a small, economically depressed old mining town in Appalachia. I lived alone. On one of the first warm nights of spring, I awoke at around 4 a.m. to the sound of my doorknob turning. I figured someone must have the wrong address. But it kept turning, persistently. I didn't have a peephole or window to see who was outside, so I just approached the door from inside and yelled, "Wrong place, buddy." Then the door started shaking violently, and a hand began punching it. I tried one last time, "Wrong place. Go away, man." Someone on the other side growled at me and started making horrifying noises like a wild animal. I grabbed a kitchen knife and called the police, then waited inside. About 10 minutes later, there was a knock on the door. I opened it cautiously to see an officer who questioned me about the incident. Then he asked me to close it again and remain inside. Again, I couldn't see what was happening out there, so I just turned out the lights and waited quietly with the knife in my hand. For about 20 minutes, there was just silence. Then, out of nowhere, my living room window screen started to get pushed inside and the curtain started to move. The guy was pushing out the screen and trying to climb inside. I held up the knife and yelled, "I'm gonna kill you," in my most threatening voice possible. Thankfully, I immediately heard, "Get on the ground. Show me those hands." Heard another horrible wail from outside as the guy was presumably tackled and taken to a police car. A few minutes later, another knock at the door. The officer was back to tell me that the suspect had been captured. This guy was a uniformed cop, but he was visibly trembling and super pale. I still hadn't seen what the intruder looked like. The next day, I ran into the officer while he was off duty, small town, and he told me that the suspect had told them his name was Jason Voorhees. Probably a meth addict or some other type of drug user. Those habits don't go well with delusions involving slasher film characters. I used to rent a room in a basement apartment. My friend's family lived in the real house upstairs, which is how I ended up there. They have a lot of family parties. They're first-generation Filipino. Family parties are a frequent thing. One day I was doing some homework in my room. The other two tenants weren't home, so I had apartment B to myself. But they were being so loud upstairs, I was having trouble focusing. So much chatter and feet moving around. Sounded like dancing was going on. I texted my friend, "You guys sound like you're really having a good time up there. I'm not really getting anything done, can I come up?" He texted back, "No one is home, we went to Wisconsin for the weekend." I went outside, saw that no one's car was there, and no lights were on in the house. And then I just went for a walk until someone else got home. I moved to Miami around 2009-ish, and I started working for a real estate company. This was around the heyday of foreclosures and short sales. Well, the broker/owner of the company approached me one day and was like, "Hey man, I know you have an apartment already, but how would you feel about staying at one of our places rent-free?" Me, being broke, jumped for the idea. It worked out because my roommate wasn't interested in renewing the lease, so off I go. Turns out it was a 5/3 decent-sized house. I'm a single guy in my mid-20s, so I had a bed and a computer/TV. Needless to say, I only used one room. However, when I finally got to the place, it was super creepy. So I took the master bedroom and closed off all the other rooms. First few nights were fine. Then one night, I was making some pasta and I filling up the pot to boil it, and I hear the faucet in the creepy bathroom I never used turn on. It was attached to the kitchen. I immediately turned off the kitchen faucet and it stopped. So I was like, there is no way this happened, and walk into the bathroom, and sure enough there were water droplets in the sink. I thought I was going to have a heart attack. From that point on, other weird things happened, like I would wake up and my mattress, king size, would be like halfway off my bed in the morning, and the chain pull light in the bedroom would come on in the middle of the night. I was never so happy to move out of a place in my life. Turns out, I was basically a squatter for my boss so that the bank couldn't foreclose on the house while she was negotiating with them. Within a week of me being gone, they changed the locks and seized the house. Alone in my aunt and uncle's house in rural Ireland. It was wintertime and about 6 p.m. in the evening, so dark outside. I wasn't expecting them back for another hour or two. Was playing Commandos on their PC all day, and as it grew dark I hadn't bothered to turn on any lights. Get up to go piss and don't bother turning on any lights. As I'm pissing I hear a vehicle come up the gravel lane. Finish up and go look out the window. It is a white van. I see 3 men get out of the van. I drop to the floor and immediately start crawling towards my aunt and uncle's bedroom. I open their wardrobe and crawl into it. It's a huge old oak wardrobe. I throw some cloths over myself and hide there. All I can think of is gypsies are here to rob the place. I very softly hear them speaking outside. Doing that loudish whisper to each other. Someone tries the front door, but thankfully it's locked. I hear them talk and walk around the side of the house. I think I hear the back door being opened, but remember it's locked. Then for a long time I hear nothing. After what felt like a lifetime I hear another vehicle come up the lane. It stops and out gets my uncle. He begins talking to the men, shouting, but I can't hear what he is saying. My mind races thinking something bad is going to happen. Then I hear laughing and chatting. I crawl out of the wardrobe and peek out the window. My uncle clearly knows these men and is having a friendly chat. Even though no one can see me I go red with embarrassment. I go back to the PC and sit there embarrassed. About 2 weeks ago my depression was kicking my butt, so I decided to cancel my evening plans and just lie down for a nap. Shortly after sunset I heard loud pounding on the front door alternating with rapid doorbell ringing. In the back of my head I thought Ups was being aggressive, but I still felt like crap, so I ignored the noise. About 10 minutes later I heard a loud thump in the kitchen and assumed my cat had knocked something over. I got up from bed and was about to open the door to the bedroom when I saw beams from a flashlight underneath the door. I called out, "Hello?" And the light disappeared. I walked into the kitchen and noticed the door was still locked but ajar, and my cat was standing at the top of the basement steps looking down into the darkness. At that point I received notification from my partner, who was out of state for work, that something had tripped the motion sensor camera in the kitchen. 2 men had broken into the house and it was unclear where they had gone once they went back out the kitchen door. I called 911 and 5 officers and a canine unit were at the house within minutes. They sent the dog into the basement and it didn't find anybody. The would-be burglars hadn't had enough time to take anything but my sense of security, but it wasn't until I was telling my coworkers the story the next day that it started to hit me how much worse it could have been. November sucked this year. I'm so grateful it is finally a new month. When I was a teenager, I was staying at home alone for a night while my parents were at a wedding somewhere. This was a very remote house, up in the mountains where I'd have to hike for half a mile to get to the closest neighbor. I was on the computer around midnight when I thought I heard a noise outside, so I got up, turned on the outside lights and peered out through the window, and as I looked around I suddenly spotted a face just far enough for the light reached, staring right back at me. I jumped and ran, only to realize I had just jumped at my own, very faint reflection in the window. I made sure there was nothing outside, but my heart was still pounding and I was still on edge, so I decided that was enough computer for the night and it was time to go to bed. I went around the house turning off all the lights and everything, and just as I'm about to go up the stairs, I hear an absolutely horrendous noise right behind me. I'm not even sure how to describe it. Imagine if someone with the driest throat in history tried to scream at the top of his lungs, overlaid with the dying roar of a lion, and you might get close. If there are monsters in the world, this was the sound they make. Well, it turns out my mom had left this water feature running, and whenever someone turns it off, like I just had, it makes that sound about 30 seconds later, just long enough that a poor scared kid like me can't make the connection of where the noise came from. I survived, but it was a while until I was willing to stay home alone again. I was home alone just a few years back. My parents tend to go out to a dance club a couple towns away, small town, and don't get back until about 4 or so in the morning. This day, just like any other, I was sitting in my room next to my window watching something on TV, who knows what, probably Scrubs. My bedroom window is fairly big and frosted with a dark curtain covering it. It sits directly next to our front door, which leads to a porch. It's about 2 in the morning and suddenly I hear this loud banging on my window, not a foot from my face. Confused as to why someone would hit my window so hard, I wait a minute or so to see if someone calls out or knocks again, when suddenly, 3 more desperate knocks on my not so thick window. At this point I start comparing my situation to that of a horror movie and convince myself that checking will lead to a certain death. I finally grow the balls to check who it is from the inner door of the porch and see faint movement in the parking lot in front of my house. There he was, a man raggedly dressed, not menacingly but indecently, pacing back and forth. I now decide my best course of action is to call the police and later find out he had broken into an office building across the street and a couple cars around town. Not sure what happened to the guy or why things turned out the way they did, but I'm really glad I didn't answer the door. Not positive this qualifies as creepy, so much as terrifying and tragic, but here goes. Day before Valentine's Day, 2010, I experienced the most terrifying night alone at home that I hope I ever experience, but it has more to do with the tragic as opposed to the paranormal. My mom and dad had asked me to dog sit our family German Shepherd at the house I grew up in Philadelphia while they took their first and only vacation since my brother or myself had been born. The plan was for them to be gone 8 days, but the night in question, the third night after they'd left, was reason enough for them to come home early. I was sleeping on the couch in the living room, as my old bedroom was now a storage room for my dad's stuff, and around 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. an explosively loud bang woke me up from a dead sleep, and my dog started going crazy. I assumed it was his barking that had woken me up, so despite being scared shitless, my first thought was to sit up on the couch and call him over to me to reassure him that everything was fine and he could go back to sleep, but just before I was going to sit up to do that, I heard a woman scream, "No. Dad, no." In absolute terror, followed by another incredibly loud bang, and immediately felt tiny wood splinters fall into my eye from the wall the couch was against as they trickled down onto my face. That second bang turned out to be the sound of my neighbor shooting and killing his daughter. Those wood shavings that had gotten into my eye. They were from where the impact of either her body or the bullet, or both, hitting the wall directly on the other side of where I was sleeping had splintered some of the brick between our houses and caused my living room wall to push in a few millimeters. My head would have been pretty damn close to this spot had I actually sat up after the first bang to reassure my dog. Given that the bullet didn't actually come through the wall, I would have been fine even if I had sat up, but knowing what I know now, I'm glad I laid there for that extra second. Naturally, I called 911, made sure my front and back doors, and all the windows, were locked, because the last thing I needed was for the guy to try to get into my house, and within 3 minutes the next bangs I was hearing were those of the police kicking the guy's door down and screaming for him to get on the ground. I sat at my window and watched them walk him out in cuffs and put him in a cruiser, and it wasn't until the cops in the one cruiser had driven away with him in the back that I finally opened my door to talk to the other cops that were still on the scene and talk to some of them about what I'd heard, give a statement and all that. A week later I was subpoenaed to testify against him in court because he was claiming that the whole thing was an accident. However, I heard his daughter scream, "No. Dad, no." Before he fired the second time, no way in hell it was accidental. Testifying against him was terrifying, because if he got off, well, he was my parents' neighbor and I knew he wasn't above murder. Thankfully, the DA made sure he didn't get off. He's 70 years old now and has another 20 plus years of jail time with no possibility of parole. Scariest night alone I've ever experienced. It was the dead of winter and I lived back a private drive about half a mile off of the main road. I have no neighbors, only an abandoned apartment building next door. The snowfall was very heavy that night, all footprints were erased leaving the ground with a blank slate. My family would not return for a few hours and my phone had died and I was looking for a charger. The dogs began barking into the darkness outside the windows. Then I heard a series of knocks, so powerful that it seemed someone was striking my door as hard as they could. I go to the door, look outside and find no one there. Then the knocking started at the back door, a glass panel door with a motion detector overhead. The light did not turn on and I could not see anyone standing there. Then both doors were knocked upon at once, very violently shaking them. My home phone was malfunctioning so I couldn't call the cops and my cell phone hadn't charged enough to turn back on. I grabbed my shotgun and closed all the curtains in the house so if anyone was out there then they couldn't watch me. The knocking spread to the windows, some 2 stories off the ground, and made rounds from door to door. Once my phone turned back on I called my mom and told her what was going on and she told me not to call the police unless someone tries to get into the house. She thought it was some kids from our non-existent neighborhood. Eventually I opened the front door and looked around for whoever was doing this, cautiously of course, but what I saw chilled my heart. There were no footprints anywhere outside, not even indents in the snow, and once I was back inside the knocking resumed. About 20 minutes later it subsided. To this day I still get freaked out being home alone. The hallway between my room and the bathroom is the creepiest place in the world. I cannot and never have been able to sleep with the door open because I always felt like there was something watching me. I stayed in another room in the house for a while and I never had this problem, nor have I ever had the problem when staying anywhere else, But as soon as I moved back into this room, the feeling came back. Even during the day or with the lights on, it's a little freaky, but at night and in the dark, that being watched feeling intensifies. Even worse, the feeling sometimes follows me into the bathroom. More than once I have been utterly and 100% convinced that there is someone else with me in the bathroom when I'm in the shower, only there's no one there. What makes this even creepier is that there is the potential for ghosts in the house. My mother's first husband died of cancer, and she has said that she sometimes thinks that he's still hanging around. My father also swears that my uncle is here, even though that doesn't make much sense since he never spent that much time in the house. My father has also claimed to see shadow people, usually in this hallway. So either my mom's first husband is creeping on me in the bathroom, or my uncle is. We've also had quite a few animals die over the years, and sometimes I still hear them. My old dog's tags jingling, our incredibly overweight cat walking around, my hamster from when I was 12 running in his wheel. I also think that I've seen them, in particular our long-haired gray cat, and there have been times when I've felt something jump up on my bed, only for nothing to be there when I look. But that's more comforting than creepy to me, so take it as you will. Something about my house is that everyone in my family always hear different things and have different experiences in my house. We always hear footsteps upstairs when no one is there. The footsteps also always happen on a walkway where you can clearly see if anyone or anything is there. There are also weird things about my room and my sister's room because people can't stand to be in my room because they always get creeped out, and in my sister's room people always have a feeling of being watched, like something is in my sister's closet. So a few years ago I was home alone for the day. I decided I wanted to watch TV downstairs since I always got creeped out when I was upstairs by myself. I have 2 dogs who were both on the couch with me, and we were just minding our own business and relaxing on the couch. Then out of nowhere I hear the loudest smack on the kitchen counter right behind the could. It sounded like someone just slapped the counter with their hand, and it was loud enough to go through the house. My dogs both jumped off the couch and went in the corner on the other side of our living room with their tails between their legs, and they just kept shaking. I jumped up and went to my dogs. After a few minutes I decided to go and check the kitchen, which was visible from the living room. I slowly walked over to the living room and looked for anything that could have fallen or broke. I couldn't find anything at all, and I am always freaked out to sit on my couch with my back facing the kitchen. When I was in my early 20s, my family went on vacation without me. They were gone for about 2 weeks. I took care of the dog and cats, worked long shifts at my part-time job, and cooked good food that wouldn't vanish after I had one serving. My family is noisy. I have several younger sibs, and they are always shrieking, shouting, and stomping, and they always slam doors closed. I got some great sleep with them out of the house, but at night it was a little too quiet, so when I made my rounds of locking the doors before bed, I'd turn on the TV for some noise, but leave the volume on the low side. I stayed up late the night before the family was coming home. They told me they were leaving their vacation place at about a certain time, and you could always safely add an hour to their planned departure time, and I knew how long the drive would take them. They'd be home late in the afternoon the following day at the earliest, but most probably after dinner time. I didn't have to work that whole day, so I slept in. In those days, it was common for me to sleep past noon. I heard the car pull into the driveway. I heard one brother and the youngest sister bicker as they got out. Mom saying that she'd check to make sure I was collecting the mail. Dad slamming the driver's side door. Someone unlocking the front door. My middle sister shouting, "We're home." And then various other sounds as they brought in their bags and filled the house with its usual noise level. But I stayed in bed. I could hear them clearly, I could picture their actions to go with each noise, but I was thinking 2 things: they're way early and I'm warm and comfortable right here. Then one of them started pounding up the stairs. And I suddenly felt this creeping dread. I was sleeping on my side, facing away from the door. Someone called my name. I heard a conversation between the parents. Well, her car's in the driveway. My door started to open. I was paralyzed with fear. It wasn't that I couldn't move, it's that I was too afraid to move. The sounds of my family seemed completely normal, but I felt like there was something terribly wrong. But as my door opened, the thing squeaks, I knew I had to move, to see who was there, to defend myself. I rolled over, pushed aside my blankets, sat up. My bedroom door was open. Nobody was there. I got up. The house was empty. The front and back doors were locked. Only my car in the driveway. The TV was off. I was home with my son one night when my husband was working late in the dead of winter. My son was 3 at the time. We were watching TV on the couch upstairs when all of a sudden we heard this huge crack. Sounded like it was coming from above us. It's a 1-story home, so all that's up there is the roof. I muted the TV and just sat with him in silence. A few minutes later, another crack. It sounded like wood splintering or splitting, but very loud, and this time was coming from in front of us outside the window. My heart was pounding so fast, I jumped to the window and looked around, but there was nothing out there. The whole neighborhood was quiet. About 20 minutes passed and we hadn't heard anything, so I turned the volume back on the TV and went back to the show. Not 2 minutes later, this massive ear-splitting cracking sound lasting about 5 seconds comes directly above my head. I felt it shaking the couch. I grabbed my son and threw his boots on and ran outside to the car. At this point I am convinced someone with an axe is breaking in through the roof. So I drove up the street and around the corner a ways where I could get a good view of the roof. There was nothing amiss whatsoever. After sitting in the driveway on the phone with my husband for almost 10 minutes, we ultimately realized it was a phenomenon called ice quakes that happens in extreme cold. That winter they were all over the news. People reported it sounded like their homes were cracking apart. It has to do with the ground moving and homes shifting after a flash freeze. We ended up hearing them intermittently for the next few days, but never as loud as that first night alone. When I was a kid, I'd often have the house to myself as both of my parents worked. At some point I started hearing my parents yelling my name, and whenever I'd go and ask what they needed, they said that they didn't call me. Once, when my mom and I were the only ones at home, I heard my name being called from the bedroom, but my mom was in the kitchen, which was in the opposite side of the house. Then I began to hear my name being called when I was home alone. It sounded exactly like my mom most of the time, but sometimes it was my dad's voice. That went on for a while, and whenever I heard it I would just turn on the TV or increase the volume and ignore it. Basically I convinced myself that I was just hearing things. One day I was playing in our backyard with my neighbor and it was getting late, so I was about to head back inside when I heard it in the backyard. I was staring at the house and then I tell her no one is home, and ask her if she heard it too. I looked over because she wasn't answering me, and she was just slowly nodding and looking at my house, focused on something. So I asked her what was up, and then she snapped out of it and says that it was nothing. At that point I just decided to just stay out for another hour cause I didn't want to go in. I used to live in a ranch-style house where a wall had been knocked down between 2 bedrooms, turning 2 tiny rooms into one long normal-sized room, with 2 doors. The resulting big room was sort of L-shaped. If you walked down the hallway, there was a room on the right and a door straight ahead. My mom/stepdad's room was the door on the left, so adding the room on the right to the room straight ahead at the end of the hall is what made the stubby L-shaped room. Anyway, I used the door on the right to go in/out, and I put a recliner right behind the door at the end of the hall, and used to sit there to read and watch TV. I used to sit in that chair and hear my stepdad get home, slam the back door, and come stomping down the hall, and stomp down the hallway, and stop right outside that door. I'd sit there listening for him to go into his room and stop standing outside my door. I'd wait. And wait. And wait. He'd just stand there in the hall, right outside my door, just inches from where I was sitting. Eventually, I'd go outside to see why he was standing out there. I'd go out the other door, the one I used, without a chair in front of it, no one there. No one was in the house. No cars were in the driveway. No place anyone could be hiding. It happened again and again and again, always the same way. I'd be alone in the house, hear a man come in, slam the back door, come stomping down the hall, get to the door I had blocked with the recliner, and just stop. I finally asked my mom if she'd ever seen or heard anything creepy in the house. She just kind of froze and said, "Well, yes. Why?" So I told her about the stomping man and asked her if she'd heard it too. She hadn't. She said she'd been alone in the house, been doing things in the kitchen, left the room, and come back to find drawers and cabinets open. She said she would have assumed she accidentally left 1 or maybe 2 open herself if she was distracted, but she'd leave for a few seconds and come back to find all the drawers open, but didn't hear the sound of them opening. They were just suddenly open. It was creepy as all hell, and my mom didn't have it long. She sold it and moved even further into the country, where the creepiest thing around was all the damn mosquitoes. About 4 years ago my then girlfriend, now fiancé, moved in together. I had my own place that I still had a running lease on, so when she moved to my town, she got her own place. Now my town is more like a section of a large US city. A neighborhood on its own. Rent isn't the cheapest and she wasn't making a lot of money in her new career, so she got a smaller 1-bedroom apartment with a nice living room, kitchen, and bathroom. Nothing too amazing, but definitely not slumming it. After my lease ran out we moved in together. So she had her place for about 3 months before I moved in full time, staying there about half the days of the week other times. After the first few weeks I noticed that the apartment, First floor of a row home house, seemed to have its own personality, so to say. Random spots of cold in a corner where there was no source of a draft or reason for it to be cold in just that one area. Weird electrical issues. 1 month everything is fine, the next things are turning off for no reason or lights are flickering. Chalk this up to it simply being an old row home, which is an apartment in a high turnover area. However, around that time other weird things started happening. Nothing was ever malicious or did I ever feel scared, but there were many times I felt as if I was being watched or someone else was in the apartment. It's that weird feeling of the presence of another person. There were many times where I would catch glimpses of someone moving. Never a view of a ghost, person, or even seeing anything tangible. It would be instead during situations where I was distracted or focusing on something else. For example, one time I was cleaning the dishes in the kitchen. The living room door is right to the left of the sink. I was doing the dishes and out of the left corner of my eye I catch what appears to be movement flash in my peripheral and move across the living room. Again, not necessarily an object, but what my peripheral vision caught as movement. I then felt the presence of someone. So strong in fact that I stopped washing the dishes for a moment and checked the bedroom to see if somehow my fiancée came home early and I didn't hear her come in. Nope. Nothing. Nobody. Even though every part of my body felt as if another person was in the house and my mind was so sure I saw movement. There was just nobody in the apartment but myself. Another time that really stands out was a few months after. I was working in the basement. Basically, since this apartment was on the first floor, we had access to the basement to store our stuff. It's also where the heater and stuff was for the other 2 units, but since the only access was from our apartment, it was considered ours to use. So I set up a small little workspace down there. This night after work I went down there to tinker with a shelf I was building. When we went to bed that night I could see light from the basement through the crack in the floorboards by the heating vent. Apparently I forgot to turn off the light on the workbench I had. So I get out of bed and walk downstairs and turn the light off. As I start to walk back up the steps from the now dark basement I get a very intense feeling of leave. In my mind. Like walking down a dark alley and somehow you know something is off. At the same time I get this feeling, I also get the goosebumps, heebie-jeebies type feeling. I get out of the basement and go lay back down in bed. My fiancée asked me what was that yell for. I had no idea what she was saying. I didn't say a word to myself in the basement. Not even a mumbled. She continued to say as I was coming up the stairs she heard me scream loudly like something scared me or was generally yelling. Made me feel even more unusual as I know I didn't say anything at all, but she was adamant that it was a person screaming and that there is no other cause for what she heard. So these things continued. Again, never did we feel scared or as if it was too much to handle. It was always little things like seeing people pass in the living room through your peripheral. My fiancé noticed it also. After the screaming incident we decided to check to see if there are any cases of haunted houses in our area. It seemed plausible since our row home apartment was literally right next to a graveyard. Like old school 1700 to 1800 graveyard that consists of a lot of dead babies. We figured the graveyard might be haunted, and since we are weird people we decide to look up haunted places in our area and our address or general location in particular. Well, that was a mistake. We come to find out that there used to be an old church that occupied the property. This would explain the random graveyard next to row homes. The church burnt down many years ago, which is when the row home that is our apartment was built. So yay. I think living in a home that is on land that an old church used to occupy and eventually burnt down on, as well as sharing your backyard with a cemetery consisting largely of deceased infants, might contribute towards some spooky. I wasn't really alone, but I was babysitting these 3 kids, 5, 3, and a 7-mo, and it was like 9 p.m. so they were all sound asleep. So I was basically alone. Figure this, I was in the living room. In the living room, there's a TV and very large windows that look out into the yard and street. Attached to the living room is an entryway for the kitchen and an entryway to the hallway, and the hallway and kitchen share another entrance too. The kitchen has a back door with a big door and a screen door, and directly across from that door is the entrance to the hallway, where the landline sits on a little table. This is important. So, kids are upstairs sleeping and I'm in the living room watching TV, and I just so happen to glance out the window and there's a man. I'm 99.9% sure he had his dick out in the yard. I was young and stupid, so I thought, okay, there's just a weirdo outside. That's fine, he'll go away by himself, and I kinda pretended not to notice and kept watching TV, occasionally shifting my eyes to the window to keep an eye out. After a while, I glance out and he's moved through the bushes and was an inch away from the glass. It looked like he was masturbating because he was kinda like, shaking in that kind of way for lack of better phrasing. I still pretended not to notice, but I casually got up to go call someone. I couldn't decide if I should have called the cops or my mom or the kid's mom, but before I really figured out, I hear a rattling, and I look behind me. The man is trying to open the screen door. The big door was wide open because it was nice out, and the screen door was locked because the family cat knows how to push it open and escape if it's not locked. But the man is trying to get in, and I'm basically shutting down because of fear and adrenaline, and it felt like something took over my body because all I remember was fumbling with the keypad on the phone, and suddenly the cops were there and the man was gone and the parents were called and everybody was okay. Kids, too. Scary, though.